All right, so we've made it to this last last lesson of Chapter 3. In the last video, we briefly talked about governments and the types of governments that exist. So this section is all about economies. It's not always everybody's favorite topic, but it's an important one. So we're going to talk about different key terms that are used in economics, terms like labor, capital, the different types of economies that exist, which is influenced by government as well. So we're going to be able to describe resources people use to get what they want and need. That's kind of where all this starts from. The economic systems, I already mentioned that, and how these economies interact together. And we'll also describe like organizations that exist to support economies around the world. So we have resources, and those are the supplies that we have to meet our wants and needs. And I really like this. There's an illustration coming up here in the next slide, I think. But there are these three questions that really have to be answered by all economies, and that is what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom it's going to be produced. And so you can see those three questions down here at the bottom. But I like how this is set up because it talks about how we have unlimited wants. We can all think of just additional things that we'd like to have. Maybe that's a snack right now, or maybe that is, something we need new highways, or we need a new technology advance. We need cars that run purely on electricity, or we need to eliminate fossil fuels and that we only have solar and water power. Like there's always something that we need. But then if you look over here, it says we have limited resources. And that's not just the supplies, but it's also we have limited amount of labor. We have limited amount of education to some degree. So which leads to scarcity. And the scarcity means that scarcity just means when there's not enough of something. So we have to make choices. And that choices brings us to the decision of what to produce, because you can't produce everything. You're going to have to make decisions about what to produce in an economy. There are some things in Indiana here that we can't grow, right? Like we could put all of our energy into growing pineapples, but you know what? We're not going to be able to produce very many pineapples. So we have to specialize to some degree in certain things to produce those. We have to decide how we're going to produce them, what kind of machinery is going to be used, what kind of technology and all those types of things, and then who will those things go to. So once we kind of have that out of the way, we can kind of talk about some of these different types of economies that exist. And so the first one is a traditional economy. And this is what you would find in very developing societies, especially societies from long ago. And you would still find it in less developed areas. And I think about like maybe indigenous groups that still live in the jungles somewhere, or just isolated groups that those tribes or those group of people really do trading on their own. Maybe they farm to some degree, and then they trade that among people in their group or with other groups nearby. There really isn't like a government, and there may be currency. There may be a lack of currency. Money that changes hands. It may be more like a bartering system. So that's kind of like it's usually distributed through families. So this is kind of like the most basic level of economies. And then we move up to a market economy. And I'm sure you've heard of this term before, capitalism. It's often used to kind of describe the United States because in capitalism, businesses are privately owned. Apple was created by a group of people, and so was Microsoft, and so was Nike, and all these different companies. And production is guided really by those private groups. But we don't have just a pure market economy because there is some government intervention. Government does control things. They help regulate things. For example, there's a minimum wage, and that's something the government states, and so places have to honor that. So the government is kind of intervening to some degree. So we're not a pure market economy, because the government would completely stay out of everything if that was the case. So in a command economy, it's completely the opposite, and that's where it's extremely controlled by government. The means of productions are publicly owned. Actually, I should take a step back here because I kind of get these two. I often think of communist countries But here, a command economy is really referring to communal, where everybody owns everything. So in a lot of tribes, this may be more of the case of there is more communal ownership of everything. There may be farmland, and then all that grain is just distributed to everybody in the community, so everybody has access to it. It's not really a trading system like we would see in a traditional economy. Just everything that's owned is distributed. So a communism is one type of command economy, but I think you'll see in kind of one of our last examples of socialism, that kind of really fits more with a lot of communist countries today. Um, it's interesting. Like some parts of we'll talk about North Korea later on, which is controlled by a dictator, um, and I would say it would have elements of a command economy, but also maybe kind of some elements of socialism as well. A mixed economy is really what the United States has, and that's where industries are privately owned, but then some of them are also owned by the government, and there's some things the government does that nobody else can do. So we are a mixed market economy here in the United States. And so this last term I already kind of referenced it, socialism, property and the distribution of goods and the income are controlled by the community. So China has kind of moved to maybe away from a command economy and more to this socialist market economy that has a blend of kind of both. They're not as much. They have more government control than we would have in the United States here, but socialism is kind of more of a blend of those two. So they get a little confusing, especially I feel like communism and socialism get confused because I feel like those terms are often intermixed. Um, I think it's just kind of important to know some of the similarities and some of the differences between those. Um, all right. So kind of moving on here, land, labor, and capital are the kind of like the three factors of production. And land is like where all the natural resources are produced. Labor is all the paid workers that can work in an area. And capital is all the factors that include human-made resources used to produce their goods. But capital can be a lot of things. Like improving your human capital would mean getting more skills and education. But capital can also be, all the things that are needed to produce something. So obviously, some economies we have are parts are agriculture, and then we also have service groups, service industries, and these kind of break down into different sectors. And the primary sector is produces raw materials. So I think about like mining would be an example of a primary sector, or logging operations would be examples of that. The secondary sector are what are made out of that. So if uh, a factory produced wooden chairs, that would be a secondary sector because they're going to take the wood that's cut down by the logging operation and use to make chairs. Tertiary sectors are going to be providing services. So maybe an example of that would be like Verizon and AT&T, right? They're providing a service. They're not really providing. It is a good, I guess. They provide you with phones and things like that, but they're providing a service. And really, a lot of the jobs today that exist are in this service industry. If you're a web developer or something like that, you're providing a service. It is creating a product, but very different from the products of long ago where everything came out of a factory. Much of what's created today is more digital in nature, and so it is more of a service. This is an important slide. This is one that we usually put on the test. And so let's talking here about the ways that we measure economic success of a country. And that is done through these three words, and the term is called gross domestic product. And it's the total dollar value of all the goods and services produced in a country during a single year. And so it's this dollar value, and it's kind of a great way of reflecting wealth. The higher that number, kind of the wealthier the country is, and the wealthier the people are on average. We may not classify ourselves individually as wealthy, but when you kind of look at like the GDP of the average person, or the average, per capita, which means like per person, comparing like the United States to other countries, it's significantly higher. So it kind of redefines what we might think of as wealthy. Standard of living is a level at which a person or a group of nations live and is measured by the extent to which it meets its needs. So as the GDP is higher, the standard of living is higher. This talks about sustainable growth as the growth rate of business. I think we can kind of skip past this slide. You might need to fill these in on your notes, so I'll just kind of skip past that. We kind of talked about land, labor, and capital already. This just kind of illustrates that a little bit better. Developed countries are industrialized countries, which usually have higher GDP. Developing countries are less industrialized, they're producing less, and they're often going to have that lower GDP. Here's a slide that shows that, and I think my screen here, my webcam's in the way, but you can see the United States has the highest GDP in the world. And that just kind of shows, I mean, a lot of these countries here are major in creating things and exporting things. You know, lots of things come from China, lots of things come from Japan. You know, look at tags sometime, you're going to see those things are made, and a lot of things we have in our country are made from other countries. So this kind of brings us to trade, which all countries kind of have to do. So trade occurs between countries. And that has two components. There's an export. Those are goods that are sent out of the country to sell, and imports are the things that come in that are bought. And there's these tariffs that are placed on those things for imports and exports. And then free trade, down here at the bottom, says an arrangement whereby a group of countries decide to set little or no tariffs or quotas can occur. And so they do this sometimes to reduce the cost. So I think a lot, like coffee is often labeled as free trade, fair trade. I think it has both names to it. And much of the coffee comes from countries that are fairly developing, especially in Africa and South America, Central America. And if the coffee carried with it a large tariff, that would raise the price here in our country, and it would make it so that people would buy less of it. So they can reduce these tariffs as an incentive for people to purchase that, because the tariff just gets passed on to the buyer anyway. So if they can lower the tariff, that's going to produce more sale of that item, and then it's going to go back to the country. This just kind of shows where things are produced. So you can see like Mexico produced 20% automobiles. There should be a key, I would think, somewhere on here. Oh, yeah. And then machinery. So the United States is, what is that one? I haven't interpreted this. That was machinery, 16% automobiles. That's kind of interesting. So, like, you might say, well, more cars are produced in Mexico than the United States, which is true based on this, but I would guess a lot of these cars manufactured here are actually U.S. companies that sent jobs to Mexico, sent factories to Mexico because they can manufacture things cheaper. So cars may be made in Mexico, but they're probably U.S. cars. But we see also 10% oil, and probably over here, look at this. We'll talk about Saudi Arabia over here, 87% oil. And much of the oil prices are dictated by the Middle East. So like we said, certain areas specialize. Saudi Arabia is desert. We don't see farming really listed here, right? Animal products, foodstuffs. We don't see any of that showing up for Saudi Arabia because they wouldn't specialize in something like that. But they have tons of oil, and that's where their wealth comes from. So interesting kind of map. There are advantages to trade. It can help build an economy. It increases globalization, countries beginning to work together. But it means jobs might be lost because of importing certain goods and services. So like I said, car manufacturers moving to Mexico lowers the price of our cars and keeps that lower because, which is good, right? But that means jobs leave our country, and that's not so good. So there's always advantages and disadvantages to the trade that happens and choices that are made by industry to keep prices lower or keep the supply going. These are different organizations. The most important ones here are on this slide. There's another couple on the next slide. World Trade Organization helps regulate trade. The World Bank kind of monitors more of the world economies. And then the IMF also does that as well, and kind of really keeps track of some of these countries that are developing. You may have heard of NAFTA before, the North America Free Trade Agreement. It's an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico about trade between those nations. And then there's also the European Union, a group of European countries. And so they have their own currency of the euro that is used among all of those. So there's some more organizations that are listed here that kind of help with that. But that's just kind of an overview of economies. Every culture has to answer those specific questions of what's going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, which is going to lead them to one of those five types of economies. Yeah, so that'll pretty much do it for this, but economies is an important part that comes up frequently in every area that we will cover. Thanks for watching.